Rain came down over Manhattan, like the sky had a grudge. At 11:47 on a Tuesday night, the ambulance bay of St. Bartholomew's Medical Center flooded with red light and the shriek of tires, and Emma Callahan was already moving before the doors slammed open. 15 years of instinct lived in her legs now. She didn't think, she ran. Gunshot, upper left chest, BP's dropping the paramedic shouted over the storm, and then the gurney was through the doors and into the trauma bay, and the world narrowed the way it always did, to hands and blood and the fragile arithmetic of keeping a stranger alive. The man on the gurney was big, broad-shouldered, expensive suit, shredded open at the collar, a watch on his wrist that probably cost more than Emma made in a year. His face was grey. His blood was everywhere on the sheets, on her gloves, blooming through the gauze faster than she could pack it. Her fingers found the entry wound and pressed, and she felt the wet heat of him surge against her palm, and some part of her that had done this 10,000 times noted, coldly, that they had maybe 4 minutes. "Sir, can you hear me? Stay with me. Look at me. I need you to look at me." And he did. His eyes dragged open, dark and unfocused, swimming up through the pain toward the sound of her voice. They found her face, landed on it, and stopped. Everything about him went still. Not the stillness of a dying man slipping under. Emma knew that stillness intimately, and this wasn't it. This was the stillness of a man who'd stopped breathing on purpose. He stared up at her like the bullet in his chest had ceased to matter, like the entire flooding, screaming trauma bay had gone silent and there was only her face above him, lit white and gold and impossible. His lips moved, barely. "It's you," he breathed. "Save your strength," she said, leaning her whole weight into the wound. "Don't talk. We've got you." His hand came up bloody, shaking and closed around her wrist, not gripping, just holding, the way a drowning man holds the only solid thing in a black ocean. 15 years, he whispered, and then his eyes rolled back and the monitor screamed one long flat note and Emma was already calling the code, already climbing onto the rail to get her weight over his chest, and she lost him into the dark, with her hands still trying to hold him in the world. She didn't lose him for good. 4 hours in the OR, and Matteo Grecci's heart kept beating, though nobody in that hospital could have told you why, given the amount of blood he'd left on the FDR drive and in Emma's trauma bay. When it was over, when they'd wheeled him up to the ICU and Emma finally peeled off gloves gone stiff and brown, she stood in the scrub room and stared at her own hands and couldn't stop hearing it. "It's you. 15 years. Probably delirium. Men said strange things when they were dying. She'd been called by a dozen dead women's names by dying husbands, been mistaken for daughters and mothers and old lovers. It meant nothing. She told herself that all the way through the end of her shift, she was still telling herself that at 6 a.m., when she stepped out into the grey, wet dawn and found 4 black SUVs parked along the ambulance bay, engines running, wipers ticking, and a row of men in dark coats standing in the rain like they'd grown there. They didn't move toward her. They didn't have to. Every one of them turned to look at her at the exact same moment, and Emma understood, with the cold clarity of someone whose body knew danger before her mind did, that they had been waiting for her. A man stepped forward, older, silver at the temples, an umbrella held over nothing in particular. "Miss Callahan, not a question. Visiting hours are 10 to 8. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Whoever you're here for, you're early." The old man's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "We're here for you, actually." He tilted his head at the open door of the nearest SUV, an invitation with no invitation in it. "It isn't safe for you to take the subway this morning. Let us drive you." "I take the subway every morning. Not this one." He said it very gently, and it was the gentleness that scared her, the certainty underneath it, the way a doctor's voice goes soft, right before the worst news. "The man you saved tonight has enemies, Miss Callahan. Your name is on his intake form. By now that form has been seen by people it should not have been seen by." He stepped back, holding the door. "Please. He would never forgive us if we let anything happen to you in the next hour." Emma looked at the 4 cars, the 8 men, the rain, the ordinary morning that had stopped being ordinary somewhere around midnight. She got in the car. 15 years earlier, on a country road outside a town Emma had long since moved away from, a 17-year-old girl had been walking home in the dark because she'd missed the last bus, and she'd nearly tripped over a boy in a ditch. He'd been beaten so badly she thought at first he was already dead. Then he'd made a sound, a small, broken, animal sound, and something in Emma had simply refused. She was a big girl, soft, the kind of girl the boys at school had opinions about, and she'd carried him, half-dragged him to the tree line and out of sight of the road, because whoever had done this might come back to check, and she'd stripped off her cardigan and pressed it to the worst of the bleeding, and she'd stayed. All night. She hadn't had a phone that worked. She'd had nothing but her hands and her voice, and she'd used them both, talking to him through the dark, telling him anything, everything, whatever came into her head, that the stars were out, that morning was coming, that he was going to live because she said so, that somewhere out there was a whole life waiting for him and he was not allowed to leave before he got to it. He'd woken once, near dawn, looked up at her with dark eyes swimming in a ruined face, and she'd smiled at him. She remembered deciding to smile, so that the first thing he saw would be something kind, and she'd said, "There you are. I've got you." At first light, she'd flagged down a truck and they'd taken him to the county hospital, and Emma had gone home to sleep, and by the time she'd worked up the courage to visit, he was gone. Discharged, the desk said, or transferred. Records unclear. A boy with no name and no family that anyone knew vanished back into whatever darkness had spat him into that ditch. She'd assumed the worst. Boys like that, hurt like that, didn't tend to get happy endings. But he'd changed her whole life anyway. She'd become a nurse because of him, because of the terrible, holy helplessness of that night. The way she'd sworn that if she ever again knelt over a dying stranger, she would have more than a cardigan and a smile. She'd spent 15 years keeping a promise to a boy she believed was dead. She had no way of knowing that on the other side of the city, in a penthouse above a skyline he owned, that same boy had spent 15 years keeping a promise to her. They didn't take her home. They took her, over her objections, to a hotel, the kind with no name over the door and a private elevator and a suite bigger than her apartment, her block, possibly her childhood, and the silver-haired man, whose name turned out to be Renzo, sat across from her and didn't explain nearly as much as she wanted explained. She noticed he didn't lecture her about how much Matteo cared. He didn't say a word about it, in fact. He just did things. He had coffee brought the way she took it before she asked someone had watched her buy it, then, at the hospital cart, more than once. He had a fresh pair of scrubs waiting in her size, folded, tags off, because her own was stiff with the stranger's blood. When she shivered, a blanket appeared. None of it was said. All of it had clearly been ready for a long time. The way a room is ready for someone expected home. "How long?" Emma asked slowly. "Has someone been watching me buy coffee?" Renzo poured his own cup and didn't look up. "You should eat something, Miss Callahan. It's been a long night." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She let it sit. Outside, rain streaked the floor-to-ceiling glass, the whole grey city smeared behind it. "The man I saved," she said. "Who is he?" Renzo considered her over the rim of his cup, and for a moment she thought he'd deflect again. Then he set it down. "You already know who he is," he said. "You've known since he took your wrist. You just haven't let yourself say it yet." Emma's throat went tight. "He survived," she whispered. "The boy, on the road." "He survived," Renzo said, "because a girl he never got to thank decided he was worth carrying." He rose, buttoned his coat, moved toward the door. At it, he paused. "He'll want to see you when he wakes. He won't ask. He never asks for anything he's afraid to lose. But he'll want it more than he's wanted anything in 15 years. He looked back at her, and there was nothing threatening in his old face at all, only something that might have been grief. "Whatever you decide it kindly. He's had very little of that." She should have run. Every sensible cell in Emma's body told her to run, that whatever this was, whatever he was, it was the kind of gravity that pulled ordinary people apart. She'd spent her whole life being sensible, being the reliable one, the kind one, the girl who carried people and asked nothing back. Instead, 2 days later, she went to see him. She told herself it was medical curiosity. She told herself she just needed to know if the delirious stranger and the boy in the ditch were the same impossible person. She told herself a great many things in the elevator, up to the private floor of a private hospital, that apparently the city didn't know existed, past men who parted for her without a word because they'd all been told, Evidently, exactly who she was. Matteo Grech was propped up in a bed that looked absurd under him, too small for the size of him, tubes and monitors and a chest wound that should have killed him. He was pale. Stubble had come in dark along his jaw. And when the door opened and he saw her standing there, something happened to his face that Emma had never seen happen to any face, ever, a kind of collapse and a kind of ascension at the same time, grief and joy so tangled they couldn't be told apart. Then he mastered it. That was the part that undid her, the discipline of it, the way she watched him take that overwhelming thing and fold it down and put it away, because he'd clearly spent a lifetime learning that showing what you wanted was how you lost it. "You came," he said. His voice was wrecked, low, careful. He didn't reach for her. His hands stayed flat on the blanket, and she got the sense they stayed there on purpose. "I told them not to bring you. I didn't want you dragged into a hospital room by armed men. I've imagined finding you 1,000 ways, and not one of them was this. You imagined finding me. Every day," he said simply. "For 15 years. Emma stood frozen in the doorway with her hand still on the frame. "You were the boy," she said. "In the ditch. You were dead. I mean, I thought you were dead. I went back and you were gone. And I thought," her voice cracked, "I mourned you. I became what I am because of a boy I thought I'd failed to save. And you've been here, in this city, all this time. I never had your name." He said it like a confession, like the great failure of his life. "You saved me and I never even got to ask your name. Do you understand? I built everything I have. And I could not find one girl on one road, because I never got the one thing I needed, which was to know what you were called." His jaw worked. "Emma," Renzo told me. "Emma Callahan. I've been saying it to myself for 2 days, like I'm afraid I'll wake up and it'll be gone." She crossed the room without deciding to, sat hard in the chair beside his bed, and his hand, after a long, careful hesitation, after visibly weighing whether he was allowed, moved the few inches across the blanket and covered hers. He didn't grip it. He just held it, the way he had in the trauma bay, the way she understood now he must have wanted to that whole long night in the dark. A boy too broken to lift his own arm toward the only warm thing in the world. "There you are," he murmured, and she went cold, because those were her words, her exact words from the ditch. Words he could not possibly have heard clearly through the blood and the dark, and yet had carried for 15 years. "I've got you. You remember that?" she whispered. "I remember all of it," Matteo said. "I built a life so I'd never have to stop." She should have left it there. A miracle, a reunion, a debt paid twice over, and then back to a small, good, ordinary life. But there's no ordinary life on the other side of a man like Matteo Grech. He didn't try to keep her. That was the strange thing, the thing that dismantled her defenses one careful stone at a time. She'd braced for a monster, the SUVs, the blood. Renzo's warnings had painted a picture of a man who took what he wanted. Instead, she got restraint, and it disarmed her more thoroughly than force ever could have. He never asked her to come back. He asked if he might call. When she said yes, he called once, at a reasonable hour, and asked how her shift had been, and listened, actually listened, remembered the name of the difficult patient she mentioned and asked about him the next time. He never sent flowers, which she'd have found smothering. He sent, instead, a good coffee maker to the break room at St. Bart's, the industrial kind, because she'd mentioned in passing that the nurse's station machine had been broken for a year and no one would fix it. He didn't sign the card. She knew anyway. And he arranged the world around her, quietly, without permission, the way a man might dam a river to keep a house from flooding. Her building suddenly had a doorman it had never had. Her double shift stopped landing on the schedule without her asking anyone. When she mentioned, once, offhand, that the walk from the subway felt dark lately, the streetlights on her block were repaired within the week, she never saw any of it done. She only ever saw the after, a world gone gentler and safer around her, as if reality itself had quietly taken her side. It was on the 4th week. At the penthouse, she'd started coming to the penthouse, and she chose not to examine too closely why that she finally made herself say it. "You have to stop." He was at the window, city glittering below, and he didn't pretend not to understand. "Which part?" "The lights, the doorman, my schedule. I didn't ask for any of it, and every time I find another thing you fixed without telling me, I feel less like a person and more like something you're keeping." She heard her own voice shake and hated it. I've spent my whole life taking care of other people. I don't know how to be taken care of. It feels like drowning." He was quiet for a moment. When he turned, the danger in him was more visible than she usually let herself see, the thing that made grown men go pale in his presence, coiled and still beneath the calm. "When I was 14, he said, "I was left in that ditch by men who worked for the family I now own. I was nothing to them. A message, delivered to my father, written in my body." His voice stayed level, which was worse than if it had shaken. "No one was coming. I had made my peace with the dark. And then a girl I had never met knelt in the mud and decided, for no reason at all, that I was worth staying with." He came a step closer. "You want to know why I fix the streetlights? Because for 15 years I have known exactly what it is to be the person in the dark that everyone drives past. And I swore that if I ever found the one who stopped, she would never, not for one night of her life, be that person. That's not keeping you, Emma. That's the only prayer I know." The room had gone very quiet. Emma realized her eyes were wet. "You could have had anyone," she said. "You have a city. You spent 15 years on a chubby girl who bandaged you up on the side of a road." "No," he said. "I spent 15 years on the only person who ever proved to me that kindness was real and not a trick." He stopped, close now, and she noticed she'd been noticing for weeks that he always stopped just short of touching her, as though her body were a line he'd drawn that he did not trust himself to cross without being asked. "You don't have to let me fix the streetlights. Tell me to stop, and I'll stop. I'll live with the dark. I lived with it a long time before you." A breath. "I'd just rather you didn't." She didn't tell him to stop. That was the moment she understood she was in trouble, not from his enemies, not yet, from him, from how much she was starting to want the thing she'd spent her whole life refusing to need. His name was Dominic Vale, and Emma learned it the way you learn the name of a storm after it's already offshore and coming. She learned it in pieces, from Renzo, in the guarded days that followed, but she learned the important part from Matteo himself, and the way she learned it told her more than the facts did. They were on the penthouse terrace. He'd been quiet all evening, and finally she'd asked him what was wrong, and instead of answering, he'd pulled up his sleeve and shown her his forearm, an old scar, long-healed, a thin white seam. 15 years ago, he said, the Vale family ran everything east of the river, the docks, the freight, the unions. My father crossed them over a shipping contract, and they made an example of his son. He turned the arm over. This is where the wire went in. Dominic Vale gave the order. He was younger then, ambitious. He'd have told you he was just doing business. Emma's stomach turned over. He's the one who put you in the ditch. His men, on his word. Matteo lowered the sleeve. So I lived, and when I was strong enough, I did the only thing a boy like me could do with a life he wasn't supposed to have. I took everything Dominic Vale loved, one piece at a time, over 10 years, so patiently he didn't understand what was happening until it was mostly gone. His voice was flat, factual, and somehow that made it more terrible. I took the docks, then the freight routes, then the unions. He lost 3 sons in that war, 2 to prison, 1 to the river, and every one of them was a decision he made, and I only answered. When it was done, he was a boss of nothing, an old lion in an empty cage. And I let him live, because a dead Vale is a martyr, and a ruined Vale is a warning. That was a mistake, Emma said quietly. She was a nurse. She knew what a cornered animal did. It was a mistake, Matteo agreed. I made it because 15 years ago, a girl in the dark decided I was worth sparing. And some part of me has been trying to be worth it ever since, even with him. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw fear in him, not for himself. And now he's understood the one thing about me no one ever could. That for 15 years I couldn't be threatened, because I wanted nothing and feared nothing and had nothing anyone could take. His hand found hers on the railing, and then I found you, and I stopped being untouchable the moment I did. The city glittered below, beautiful and lethal. The ambush, Emma said slowly. The pieces were sliding into a shape she didn't want to see, on the FDR. That put you in my hospital. My name on the form. It wasn't luck. His grip tightened, just slightly. He didn't try to kill me, Emma. If Vale wanted me dead, I'd be dead. He's old, but he isn't sloppy. He wanted me wounded, and he wanted me wounded on a particular stretch of road, close to a particular hospital, on a night he already knew who worked the trauma floor. He said the rest very gently, as if softening it could make it less true. He found you first, months ago. He spent a year looking for the one soft place in me, and he found it. And then he staged the whole thing to put us in the same room so I'd do exactly what I've done. Pull you close, show him where to cut. Emma stared at him. The rain had started again, fine and cold. I'm bait, she said. You're the woman who saved my life twice, Matteo said. And the most dangerous thing in this city is that I love you. I'd rather have cut off my own hand than let that put you in his sights. But it has. And I will burn every dock and every root and every name I ever took from him to ash before I let him touch one hair on your head. His voice dropped to almost nothing. I just need you to understand what you've walked into, because it's about to get very bad. And I won't lie to you to keep you calm. You've been lied to enough by men who thought it was kindness. Here is the thing Renzo told her, later, that she never repeated to Matteo, because she understood it was the truest and cruelest map of the whole situation. For 15 years, the old man said, the reason no one could touch Mr. Grech was that there was nothing to hold over him. You can't leash a man who's already lost everything he loves. He looked at her with something close to apology. Vale didn't find a weakness, Miss Callahan. He manufactured one. He gave Matteo back his heart, on purpose, just so there'd be something left to break. A pause. You're not bait because you're weak. You're bait because you're the only thing on earth strong enough to bring him down. That's a terrible kind of power to hand a woman without asking. I'm sorry it's yours. Emma sat with that a long time. And then she made a decision that she would spend the rest of her life being both proud and ashamed of. She tried to leave. That was the part she'd remember with the most shame and the most wonder, that she packed a bag and wrote a note and got as far as the lobby of her building at 4 a.m. with her heart cracking in half, because she decided that the most loving thing she could do for the man who'd built an empire out of a memory of her was to become a memory again, to let him be untouchable. To carry him one last time the way she'd carried a broken boy through the dark quietly, at cost to herself, asking nothing. And he was there, sitting in the dark lobby, in a chair by the door, in the rain light coming through the glass, not blocking her, not stopping her. Just there, elbows on his knees, watching her with those dark, unbearable eyes, and Emma stood frozen with her bag on her shoulder and her escape dying in her chest. You knew, she whispered. I know what it looks like when kindness decides to hurt itself for someone else. His voice was very quiet. I've had 15 years to memorize it. He didn't rise. You did the arithmetic. Your life weighed against mine, and you decided yours was the acceptable loss. You've made that trade before, in a ditch. It's the bravest thing about you, and it's the one thing I will not allow. Matteo, if I disappear, he has nothing. He'll still have taken you from me. He stood, slowly, crossing the dark lobby, and I'll spend whatever's left of my life the way I spent the last 15 years looking. Except this time I'll know you're out there choosing to stay lost so I can be strong. He stopped in front of her, closer than he'd ever let himself get. That isn't strength, Emma. That's just the dark again, dressed up as mercy. I've had enough of the dark. His hands came up and finally, he crossed the line he'd been terrified of for weeks. He took her face in his hands, the way she'd taken his in the ditch, and pressed his forehead to hers, and breathed. Don't make me safe by making me alone. That was never what my strength was for. The bag slid off her shoulder and hit the floor. He didn't kiss her. He just held her face in the dark and shook, very slightly, this man that grown killers feared, and Emma put her hands over his and held on. Then we do it together, she said. Whatever's coming. I don't run and you don't hide me in a tower. Partners, or nothing. Partners, he agreed, like a vow, or nothing. She didn't know it yet, but she'd just made herself the one thing Vale hadn't planned for. Not bait, a collaborator. Vale made his move 6 nights later, and he made it smart, because he was many things, but he had never once been stupid. He didn't come for her at the hospital, where Matteo had tripled the security. He didn't come at the penthouse, which was a fortress. He came at the one seam Emma had insisted on keeping her Tuesday shift at the free clinic in Sunset Park, the one she refused to give up, the one small piece of her old life she'd fought Matteo to keep because, she'd said, if I let you wall me off from everything that made me myself, then he's already won. Matteo had argued, She'd held firm. In the end, he'd agreed, on the condition of 2 men outside. It was the reasonable choice. It was the choice a partnership makes, weighing her selfhood against the risk. It was, Emma would think later, exactly the choice Vale had been counting on them to make, because a man who studies you for a year studies your virtues too, and learns to use them like doors. They took the 2 men outside quietly. They took Emma from an exam room during a staged medical emergency, a man clutching his chest, a crowd, a corridor, a service door, and then she was in the back of a car, with a gun against her ribs, and a calm old man across from her, who did not smile, did not gloat, did not explain himself the way the villains in movies do. Miss Callahan. Dominic Vale's voice was dry and tired, an old man's voice. He looked at her, the way you look at a tool you've been told is valuable and can't quite see why. You'll want to sit still. My hands aren't as steady as they were, and this only has to go off once. He'll come for me, Emma said. Her voice didn't shake. Some deep nurse's calm held her together, the same calm that had steadied her over 100 dying strangers. You know that. That's the whole point, isn't it? Vale looked out the window at the passing dark. The whole point, he said, is that 30 years ago I had a family, and now I have a warehouse and a gun and you. He didn't raise his voice. That was what frightened her. There was no theater in him, no speech, just a flat old grief with nothing left to lose, which she understood, being a nurse, was the single most dangerous thing a human being can be. He'll come. He'll come alone, because he's too frightened for you to do otherwise. And then, for the first time in 15 years, I'll have him where I want him, not because I'm stronger. I was never stronger. Because he finally has something to lose, and a man with something to lose does the stupidest thing at the worst time. Every single time. He finally looked at her. You're not a person to me, Miss Callahan. I'm sorry. You're the last card of a man who's been losing for 10 years. I'd have preferred it didn't come to a card, but here we are. They took her to the harbor. Fog rolled thick off black water, and an old freight warehouse rose out of it like the ruin of something one of Vale's, Emma would realize, one of the docks Mateo had taken from him, which was its own kind of message. Inside, under a single hanging bulb, his men set a chair in a circle of light and zip-tied her wrists to it and stepped back into the dark to wait. And Emma, alone in the light with the fog pressing at the walls, thought about the boy in the ditch. She thought about how she'd talked to him all night, how the talking was the thing that kept them both from breaking, that as long as she had a voice, the dark couldn't have the last word. So she used it, not to plead. She looked into the shadows where Vale sat and she said, conversationally, "You've got maybe 6 men. He's going to bring the lights down before he comes in, he told me once it's what he'd do. So when it goes dark, your men are going to shoot at muzzle flashes and hit each other, and he's going to move through them like he grew up in the dark, because he did. You put him there." She let that land. "You keep saying he'll do the stupid thing. Mr. Vale, you already did it. You brought the most dangerous man in New York to a room with one door and turned off the reason he's careful." For the first time, something in the dark went still. And she'd been doing something else while she talked something small. The thing she'd promised herself she'd do. The thing that made her a partner and not a prop. The zip ties were tight, but the chair was old, and she'd spent the whole monologue working her right wrist against a rough weld on the armrest, back and forth, patient, a nurse's patience. The same patience that packs a wound for 4 minutes without stopping. She felt the plastic fray, felt it give a fraction, felt her hand come loose in the shadow of her own body where no one was looking, because they were all looking at the door, waiting for a man. She palmed the little trauma shears she carried in her scrub pocket by habit, the ones no one had thought to take off a nurse, and she held them low and out of sight, and she waited, her heart a war drum, for the dark she'd promised them. She didn't have to wait long. The lights went out. Afterward, Emma could never put those minutes in order. She'd remember them the way you remember a storm, not as a sequence, but as a single overwhelming thing, assembled out of pieces her body had recorded when her mind was too full of terror to file them. The dark, first total, sudden, the single bulb dying with the electric tick, and the fog-lit windows giving almost nothing. Then the smell, before any sound, ozone and cold water, and, a half-second later, cordite, sharp and chemical, the first shot fired blind by a man who'd panicked. The muzzle flash strobed the warehouse white for an instant, Emma saw it all in that flash, like a photograph. 5, 6 men crouched and swinging their guns at nothing, at each other, at shadows. Exactly as she'd said. Then the noise came all at once, and didn't stop the flat, hard cracks overlapping until they were one continuous tearing sound, the shriek of a ricochet off a steel beam, a man screaming somewhere to her left in a voice that climbed and then simply stopped. She got herself off the chair and down, flat, cheek to the freezing concrete, the shears clenched in her fist, and she made herself small the way she'd made the boy small at the tree line, out of the road, out of the line of the thing that wanted to kill him. And she felt him before she saw him. That was the part she'd never be able to explain. A shift in the dark, a displacement of air, someone moving toward the guns instead of away, and she understood that everyone else in that warehouse was trying to survive the dark, and one man was using it. She heard a body hit the floor close by, heard a wet, choked sound cut short, heard a gun skitter away across concrete, heard it again, closer. A grunt of effort, controlled. A man who did not waste motion. He was not spraying bullets. He was arriving, one enemy at a time, the way the tide arrives, patient and total. And each time the dark gave up another of Vale's men, Emma felt the room grow quieter and understood the arithmetic was running the other way now, running toward her. Emma, his voice, low, close, threaded through the dark, right to her, not loud. He didn't shout her name into a warehouse full of guns and paint a target on her. He put it exactly where she was, the way he'd tracked her buying coffee, the way he'd carried her name for 15 years. Stay down. Stay talking. Where are you? Here, she breathed, left of the chair. I'm loose. Matteo, I got loose. She heard him change direction. Heard, behind her, a man rise up out of the dark she hadn't known was there, the scuff of a boot, the rustle of a coat, close, too close, between her and the sound of Matteo's voice. She didn't think. She'd promised herself she wouldn't just wait to be saved. She rolled toward the sound and drove the trauma shears up and out with everything she had, felt them catch fabric and then flesh, felt the man's whole weight buckle sideways with a shout of pure surprise, and in that half-second of him off balance and lit by his own reflexive shot, Matteo was simply there, a shape resolving out of the black, and the man went down and did not get up, and the gun spun away into the dark. Then Matteo's hands were on her, patting down her arms, her sides, her face, fast and desperate and utterly silent, checking her for holes the way she checked a trauma patient. And she grabbed his wrists and said, I'm fine. I'm not hit. I'm fine. That was the last one near me. There's one more, he said against her ear, and she felt him turn, felt him put his body between hers and the last stretch of dark, and across the warehouse, in the shadow where a chair had been set in a circle of light that no longer existed, Dominic Vale's tired old voice said, Is she alive, Gretch? Everything stopped. Because if she's alive, Vale went on, unhurried, then you've won again, and I'm too old to be surprised. And if she's not, well, then for one night, finally, we're the same. Two men in the dark who lost the thing that was keeping them human. A dry sound that might have been a laugh. I did wonder which it would be. Emma felt Matteo go very still against her. The coiled stillness of the trauma bay, the stillness of a man deciding. Lights, Matteo said quietly, to no one. And somewhere Renzo's men found the panel, and the warehouse flooded white. It was over. Vale's 6 men were down. Renzo's people were flooding in through the door Vale had thought was the only one, and through a second one, Matteo had cut in the far wall an hour before Emma ever arrived, because he had walked this warehouse in his mind the way he walked every room this warehouse most of all, because it had once been his, and he had taken it, and he had never forgotten a single door. Vale had brought him to a place Matteo knew better than Vale did. The old lion had chosen his own cage. Dominic Vale sat on an overturned crate in the middle of the white light, an antique pistol loose in his hand, pointed at nothing, an old man who had run out of moves and knew it. Matteo stood over him, bleeding again. Emma saw it with a jolt of pure terror, blood down his left side, the old chest wound reopened or a new one. She couldn't tell, and the look on his face was nothing she'd ever seen on a human being. Matteo. She was up, moving, no thought in it. The nurse and the woman and the girl on the road all moving at once, her hands already going to his side. You're hit, let me. Are you hurt? He didn't look away from Vale, but his voice reached her, steady, low, unbearably gentle in the middle of all that blood. No, I'm fine. I'm right here. Say it again. I'm fine, Matteo. I'm right here. Something went out of him then. Some terrible tension he'd carried since the moment they took her, released all at once, and he closed his eyes for one heartbeat like a man who'd been holding up the sky and could finally set it down. Then he opened them and looked at Dominic Vale, and Emma understood that a man was about to die. Vale looked up at him without fear. That was the worst of it. There was nothing left in him to be afraid with. Go on, he said. It's the only ending that makes sense. You take everything I have, and then you take my life, and the story's over. And 30 years of me is a warning you tell over drinks. He set the useless pistol down on the concrete, deliberate, surrendering. I'd have done it to you. I did do it to you. Once. Wait, Emma said. Everyone in the warehouse went still. You did not, apparently, say wait to Matteo Gresh in this moment, but he stopped. Of course he stopped. He'd stopped the tide for her. Emma stepped into the light, past the guns, and stood between the man she'd saved twice and the man who'd tried to use her to end him. Her hands were shaking now, the calm was leaving her, the way it always did afterward, once the patient was stable and the body finally let itself feel what it had been through. She pressed her palm flat to Matteo's bleeding side, applying pressure, the same pressure she'd applied in the trauma bay, in the ditch. The same thing she'd apparently do for the rest of her life, keep this impossible man in the world with nothing but her hands and her stubbornness. Look at me, she said, just to Matteo. Not at him, at me. He did. 15 years ago, a man like you put a boy in a ditch, and a girl decided he was worth more than the worst thing that had been done to him. That girl is standing here. If you do this, if you become the thing that made you, then he wins. Not tonight. Tonight you already won. He wins the boy. He gets to have made you into him, finally, after all these years, and I refuse. I did not carry you through one dark so you could walk into another one. Her voice broke and she let it. Let your people take him to whatever passes for justice in your world. Let him rot in the empty cage you already built for him. But don't put his blood on the hands I've been trying to keep clean since I was 17. Come home. You're bleeding on me. Come home. For a long, long moment, Matteo Gresh looked at her, and the whole warehouse held its breath. And somewhere in that look, 15 years compressed to nothing, the ditch, the search, the empire, the loneliness of a king who'd built the world and had no one to give it to. Home, he repeated, like the word was in a language he'd forgotten, like she'd handed him something he'd never once been given. He looked down at Dominic Vale, old, ruined, unafraid, waiting for the ending he'd earned, and Emma watched him make the harder choice, the one that cost more, the one the boy in the ditch would have wanted. Renzo, Matteo said, without turning. He goes where the others went, alive. He spends what's left watching the empire he lost run without him. A pause, and something almost like the ghost of the boy in his voice. That's worse. He taught me that. Vale closed his eyes. Whether it was relief or despair, Emma couldn't tell, and she found she didn't need to. Then Matteo turned away from the man he'd come to kill, the deadliest man in New York, in a warehouse full of his own blood, turning his back on 30 years of reasons to finish it, and he let a nurse press her hands to his wound and lead him out into the fog. The scrap of cardigan lived in a small steel box in the penthouse, 15 years old, brown with old blood, the wool gone stiff. He showed it to her weeks later, both of them healed by then, the harbor and the fog settling into the past the way dangerous things settled around a man like Matteo, quietly and permanently, with no questions Emma ever had to ask. I kept it, he said, because it was the only proof I had that the night was real, that you were real, that someone once chose to save me for no reason except that I was worth saving. He turned the little scrap over in his hands, the most powerful man in New York, holding a piece of a teenage girl's sweater like a relic. After that, everyone I met wanted something. Every kindness had a price. I stopped believing kindness was even real. Except I had this, one piece of proof that once, in the dark, it was. Emma took it from him gently. 15 years ago, she'd pressed it to a dying boy's chest and never thought of it again. He'd built his whole survival around it. You didn't build an empire and then come find me. she said. She was beginning to understand him now, the whole terrible shape of him. You built it for me. Every stone. He caught her hand, pressed it flat to his chest, over the scar, over the heartbeat she'd fought for twice, so that when I found you, I'd have something worth laying at your feet. Something worthy of the girl who wouldn't let me die. His dark eyes held hers, and for the first time since she'd known him, there was no fear in them at all. I was wrong about what would be worthy. It was never the Empire. No, it was the part of me that could still choose to be the boy you saved instead of the man who was made in that ditch. A breath. You gave me that back in the warehouse. I'd taken everything from Vale, but I couldn't take that from him, the last piece he still had of me, the version of me he'd built. You took it back and handed it to me. No one's ever given me anything. His voice roughened. You've saved my life 3 times now, Emma. The road, the trauma bay, and the one that mattered most, where there wasn't a wound at all. Outside, the city glittered his city, dangerous and lonely and vast, but up here, in the held-breath quiet of a penthouse that had waited 15 years to stop being a cage, there were 2 people who had each carried the other through the dark and lived to find out the other one made it. You already had something worthy, Emma told him softly. You had the part of you worth saving. I just held on to it until you were strong enough to carry it yourself. He pressed his forehead to hers, the same gesture, the ditch, the lobby, the warehouse. Now, the same 2 people, the same dark, held at bay by the same stubborn warmth. There you are, he whispered. Here I am, she said, and for the first time it wasn't her carrying him and it wasn't him building a fortress around her. It was just the 2 of them, level, holding on. I've got you. And this time, neither of them ever had to let go. 15 years ago, a girl knelt in the dark and decided a stranger was worth staying for, and tonight, in a penthouse above a city he'd conquered for her, that same stubborn warmth finally taught a dangerous man how to be carried. Some people spend their whole lives believing kindness is a trick, until one person stays long enough to prove it isn't. If Emma and Matteo earned a place in your heart tonight, leave a like so this story can find the next person who needs to believe someone would stay. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and share it with someone who's forgotten they're worth staying for. And tell me, when Emma stopped Matteo from taking his revenge, was that mercy, or was it love asking too much of him?